The book of Marco Polo met with immediate success. It was not a travel book, because for most of the book, itineraries are quite incongruous. Marco suddenly appears at locations in the Middle East as if parachuted there, and even in China, the sequences become blurred. Furthermore, for most of the book, there is no traveler. Marco Polo appears very few times, and there is no emotional involvement on his part. It is not a merchant handbook, as trade is certainly not its primary topic. Neither is it a book of fantastic adventures. In fact, it is notably devoid of the monsters that flourish in all the other medieval narratives. The idea that he invented a lot of fantastic creatures is not based on his text, but on his illustrators. It is precisely because they found monsters missing that those who illustrated some of the lavishly illuminated manuscripts added them. The book was exactly what his title said, a description of the world. It is a geography book that conveys an impressive quantity of new geographical information about places, people, and also plants and animals. Its original language was probably Old French, but the original copy is lost. The book was immediately copied and translated, and with each manuscript changes were introduced, so that now we have several conflicting versions. At the beginning of the 13th century, the book amazed its contemporaries by the amount and novelty of the information that it contained. Some thought it to be a gross exaggeration and gave the book the nickname of Il Milione. Even so, it found a place in all major European libraries. Today there are 150 copies still extant. The amount of information that the Mongol turmoil and Marco Polo's book provided changed the European mind and opened the way for the Renaissance. It is convenient to look at the book of Marco Polo in comparison with other two works that also gained a great popularity during the 14th century, the books of Odoric of Pordenone and John Mandeville. Odoric of Pordenone, a Franciscan that arrived in China in 1321 and remained there for 3 years, left a narrative of his travel through the Middle East, India and China. Odoric was a friar and a pious one, but he keeps a complete silence about his missionary work. He was certainly familiar with Marco Polo's book, but he is much more inclined than Marco to sprinkle his narrative with strange creatures and extravagant costumes. Once in China, he was utterly struck by the cheapness of everything, by the large size and number of its cities, and by the huge navy anchored in its ports, mostly in Guangzhou and Hangzhou. Like Marco a few years before, he enhances the glory and magnificence of the Great Khan. And unlike Marco, he notices foot binding, although he sheds a neutral light over it. Also in tune with Marco Polo, he comments that Persia has been overrun and wasted by the Tartars, and he doesn't see signs of violence when he crosses the Gansu corridor. This points to the intensive reconstruction work done by Kublai Khan on the lands that were inside his realm. Odorico's text gained an enormous popularity. It was shorter than Marco Polo's, easier to read, and much more personal. He is constantly disgusted or enthusiastic about the customs and ceremonies that he comes across. He takes the reader in. By 1366, the popularity of both Marco Polo and Pordenone got eclipsed by the travels of Sir John Mandeville. This is a book constructed in its integrity from earlier sources, mostly from Prester John's letter and from Odoric of Pordenone, that he copies directly, albeit with some omissions, like foot binding. It was presented as a travelogue, even if its critics say Mandeville's longer journey was to the nearest library. But it was a well-written book, highly readable, what we will label today as a popularization geographical work. 300 manuscript copies survive, double than those of Marco Polo's book. But Marco Polo's book regained its heyday with the advent of printing. although this did deprive the book of its lavishly illustrated monsters. The first edition, a German translation from 1477, presented the book with a sober frontispiece of the author. By the end of the 15th century, all discoverers were eagerly looking into it. The Portuguese king Henry the Navigator had one copy, and Christopher Columbus took a Latin edition of the book which he annotated profusely on his second voyage. It became an essential reference for all those who traveled to China in the 16th century.